At 3:11 p.m. on March 10, 1945, above the broken ridge of the Erpeler Lay east of Remagen, Germany, First Lieutenant Emmett Ray Sloan twisted in his seat and saw 7 German fighters closing on his tail. 4 Focke-Wulf 190s were dropping in low, fast, and wide, fanning out like wolves making a circle. 3 Messerschmitt 109s held the higher perch, sliding down through torn cloud with the Rhine shining dully beneath them and the smoke of the Ludendorff Bridge boiling up from the river crossing below. Sloan was alone in a battle-scarred P-47D Thunderbolt at barely 4,300 feet. The cliffs were on one side, the river was on the other. Flak still climbed from the east bank. His radio was damaged. One direct burst from any of those 7 fighters would cut his aircraft open from tail to engine. And below him, I crowded on the bridge and approaches. Thousands of American soldiers were still trying to cross into Germany. Emmett Sloan was 24 years old, from Yakima, Washington, the son of orchard workers and a former crop duster who had spent his civilian life flying low over apple and pear rows in hot, choppy air, judging distance by instinct, wind by smell, and danger by the movement of treetops and dust. He had entered the Army Air Forces with no academy polish and no famous family name. But he already had 4 confirmed aerial victories, a habit of bringing damaged airplanes home, and the kind of practical flying sense other men noticed even when they did not fully understand it. He was a sort of American war often took for granted, ordinary on paper, unusual where it counted. That afternoon over Remagen, everything that had made him seem merely different was about to become decisive. The crossing at Remagen had become one of the most dangerous strips of air in Europe. Ever since American forces had seized the Ludendorff Bridge almost intact on March 7th, German artillery, mortars, rockets, demolition teams, frogmen, and aircraft had thrown everything possible at it. The bridge was a prize and a vulnerability at the same time. It was the first major Allied crossing over the Rhine. Every hour it stayed open, more men, more trucks, more artillery, more fuel, more momentum crossed into the heart of Germany. Every hour it stood was a humiliation to the German command and a gift to the Allied advance. So the Luftwaffe kept coming even in the last exhausted months of the war, were with small formations striking through smoke and weather for one desperate hit. Sloan's squadron had been sent to help prevent exactly that. The weather on March 10th was marginal, but workable. Broken cloud at around 6,500 feet. Visibility 10 miles in clear sectors. Worse over the bridge because engineers had been laying smoke to obscure it from artillery and air attack. Wind from the northwest, enough to drift the smoke into rolling curtains over the east bank. The 506th Fighter Squadron launched in staggered flights, Thunderbolts loaded for air cover and armed reconnaissance, with orders to keep German fighters off the crossing and, if possible, hit any road movement east of the river that threatened the bridgehead. Sloan's section crossed the Rhine shortly after 3 p.m. Your heavy flak rose almost immediately from the high ground around Linz and Erpel. Black puffs climbed through the formation in ugly, well-judged ladders. One shell burst beneath Sloan's right wing and tore a line of holes through the skin. Another showered the rear fuselage with fragments. His radio sputtered, squealed, and then dropped into static. He kept formation as long as he could. Then he saw the Germans coming. 7 fighters, well-positioned, fast. Later, some would say he could have turned west immediately and tried to drag them toward friendly anti-aircraft guns. But in the seconds that mattered, Sloan saw something else. If those German fighters broke through him and went for the bridge, they would be diving into a mass of men packed onto approaches, pontoon sections, trucks, ambulances, bulldozers, and foot columns. A single clean pass could wreck vehicles, block lanes, set fuel alight, and create panic. A coordinated strike by 7 fighters might not destroy the bridge, but it could slow the crossing at the worst possible moment. So Sloan did the one thing that guaranteed he would become the focus of the attack. He turned into them. That decision made sense only if a man understood how he thought about flying. Sloan never separated the sky from the terrain below it. That came from his civilian years. Crop dusting in central Washington was not elegant flying. It was hard, practical, and unforgiving. A pilot came down low with a loaded aircraft, ran a narrow line over crops, and at the field edge had only seconds to clear wires, reverse course, avoid drift, and line up the next row. If he turned too wide, he wasted fuel and time. If he turned too flat, wind carried him into obstacles. If he pulled too hard, he bled energy and settled. The best men learned to reverse early, roll the lift vector where they wanted it, and make the airplane seem to change direction before an observer thought it could. Sloan had spent 5 seasons doing that in rough crosswinds over orchards and irrigation ditches. It taught him a truth not found in manuals. Most pursuers fire not at what an aircraft is doing, but at what they believe it must do next. He had tried to explain that once, back in France, after a debrief in February. The mission had been over the SAR. A single BF-109 had latched onto his tail after a strafing run, and Sloan had escaped by snapping into a rolling reversal so abrupt the German overshot. Sloan had then shot him at close range. The victory was credited. The explanation was not. Major Charles Harker, the operations officer, had listened in the briefing hut with arms folded and jaw set. "A Thunderbolt isn't a trick plane," he had said. "At low altitude, you defend with speed and discipline. You don't tumble around waiting to be killed." Captain Lewis Marr, who handled gunnery instruction, had tapped the map with a pencil and added, "Too much roll, you lose sight picture. Too much throttle change, you bleed away your one advantage. That sort of thing works once. Maybe, then it gets you buried." Sloan had let them talk. He was not argumentative. He rarely raised his voice. But his wingman, Lieutenant Tommy Avila, had seen Sloan practicing the move over the field in late light, not as a stunt, not as a flourish, but as a controlled, repeatable way to force overshoot under pressure. Avila believed it. The others mostly did not. In squadron talk, it became a joke for a while. Sloan's Orchard acrobatics, Yakima air circus, that kind of thing. Now, over Remagen, with 7 German fighters behind him and no room for error, the joke was finished. The first tracers came at 3:12 p.m. They were low and slightly left, bright red streaks reaching forward beneath his tail as the nearest Focke-Wulf opened fire too early. Sloan did not yank into a panic brake. He nudged the nose down, let the Thunderbolt gather speed through 340 miles an hour, and felt for closure. The P-47 was not graceful in the European sense. It was big, heavy, and immensely strong. It could absorb punishment and carry speed through violence. Sloan knew exactly how that weight could work for him. At roughly 500 yards of closure, and just before the German pilot would settle into his lead, Sloan kicked right rudder, rolled sharply left, passed through a steep bank and then inverted, letting the nose fall toward the smoke over the river. A lesser pilot might have completed the move as one clean, descending turn. Sloan did not. Halfway through, before the Focke-Wulf had updated the geometry, he snapped the roll back the other way and pulled across the new plane of motion. To the German, Sloan had appeared to commit to one line and then simply disappeared from it. The Focke-Wulf overshot low on Sloan's left, less than 200 yards away. Sloan chopped throttle just enough to help the closure. The German flashed across the nose. Sloan's K-14 sight barely had time to settle into a rough lead. He fired all 8.50 caliber Brownings for about 1 second. The Thunderbolt shook with recoil. Tracer and Ball walked into the Focke-Wulf's engine, cowling in cockpit. Flame burst from beneath the engine. The fighter rolled once, nose down and uncontrolled, and smashed into the east bank slope just below the ridge, 1 down. The effect was immediate. The 6 aircraft behind the lead had been stacked for pursuit. Now debris, smoke, and surprise shattered their spacing. 1109 climbed hard. Another Focke-Wulf jinked right. Their neat attack line dissolved into confusion. Sloan pushed the throttle forward again and skimmed down into the lower air above the smoke. He could smell burnt powder in the cockpit. The right aileron felt heavier than before, but still usable. He knew his ammunition state roughly. A P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun. He had spent little so far. Enough remained for a measured fight, but not for waste. Every burst had to be short. Every burst had to matter. At 3:13 p.m., the second attacker came from high right, a Messerschmitt 109 diving more carefully than the first German had. This one was not overeager. He held spacing, corrected lines smoothly, and was plainly trying to stay just outside the trap that had killed his leader. Sloan saw that and changed the rhythm. He held straight for half a second longer than comfort allowed. The 109 committed more firmly. Tracers snapped by Sloan's canopy and tore past his right wing. Then Sloan rolled toward the incoming fire instead of away from it. The Thunderbolt whipped into a right bank, then through a steep climbing displacement that looked at first like a panicked brake. At the top of that motion, he unloaded, let the nose float, and then drove the airplane down and left in a slicing reversal under the Messerschmitt's expected line. The German, now committed to a lead pursuit curve, found the P-47 not only elsewhere, but crossing in a way that forced him to change from lead to lag almost instantly. He failed. For a split second, the Bf-109 presented broadside across Sloan's windscreen at roughly 220 yards. Sloan fired a short burst. The rounds hit along the nose and forward fuselage. A plume of white coolant burst from the port side. The Messerschmitt pitched up, then snapped left as the engine seized. Sloan saw the canopy come off. A dark figure tumbled free, and a parachute opened over the river. 2 down. That was when the remaining Germans began to understand the danger. Instead of attacking in a line, they spread into working elements. 2 Focke-Wulfs moved lower and wider, clearly trying to box Sloan against the river or drive him up. 2 Messerschmitts stayed higher to slash down once he committed. Another 190 hung back as reserve. It was smart and disciplined. If they stayed patient, forced him to keep maneuvering, and denied him a clean overshoot, numbers might still tell. Sloan dropped lower, nearly to 2,000 feet, and ran south along the east bank. Below him, the battlefield was an ugly masterpiece of late-war confusion. Smoke generators billowed, trucks inched over ruined approaches, engineers in helmets and mud-spattered jackets moved over steel sections that groaned under constant traffic. Muzzle flashes winked from anti-aircraft pits. Artillery smoke hung in the folds of the ground, and men on the bridge later recalled seeing a single American Thunderbolt darting and rolling above them, while German fighters took turns dropping after it. Few understood what they were seeing. Fewer still believed the number afterward until the reports were compiled. At 3:14 p.m., Sloan saw how the Germans meant to kill him. 1 Focke-Wulf stayed 400 yards back and slightly high, refusing to close too fast. Another moved low on his left to cut any turn west. Overhead, a 109 waited with altitude in reserve. If Sloan climbed, the high man would rake him. If he turned too flat, the low pair would trap him. If he ran straight, the rear fighter would keep chipping away until something important came apart. So Sloan stopped thinking about aircraft alone and started thinking like the crop duster he had once been. Ahead, the smoke from the bridge drifted against the cliff face and spread beneath a band of thin sunlight breaking through cloud. Beyond that was a narrow interval where the smoke thinned just enough to hide motion without erasing it entirely. In orchard work, that kind of light mattered. It changed depth, it changed judgment, it made men commit wrong. Sloan pulled gently into the brighter band as though climbing for room. The rear Focke-Wulf took the bait and came down. Sloan held the move until the German could see him clearly against the lit haze. Then he rolled left and dropped into the smoke edge, vanishing for a beat. The German held his line. When Sloan emerged from the smoke, he was not where the 190 expected. He came up crossing from below and opposite, the sun behind his shoulder. The closure was almost head-on. Sloan fired first. His burst struck the Focke-Wulf's engine line and windscreen. The German fighter jerked upward, stalled, and fell through its own disturbed wake. It hit the smoke curtain, emerged half-inverted over the river, and slammed into the Rhine in a flat impact that sent fire and spray outward in one violent sheet, 3 down. Now the German attack had a problem that had nothing to do with aerodynamics. Fear was beginning to enter the cockpit. Pilots can continue through fear when events fit expectation. A hard fight, losses, ground fire, even damage can all be endured if the mind still believes the next pass is manageable. But when one target repeatedly survives by making geometry feel wrong, fear changes shape. It becomes doubt. Doubt makes men hesitate a fraction too long or fire a fraction too soon. In air combat, fractions are enough. At 3:16 p.m., the remaining 4 fighters widened again. The highest Messerschmitt, perhaps the most experienced among them, stayed nearly 1,000 feet above and watched. One Focke-Wulf slid westward to block escape toward American guns. The other 2 worked opposing quarters. Better discipline, greater patience. Then came the moment Sloan nearly lost it all. A 109 dived from high right, but held outside overshoot distance. Sloan reversed under him and got nothing. The German climbed through. Almost instantly, a Focke-Wulf from left rear pressed in. Sloan rolled again, but this pilot also refused the trap. For several long seconds, Sloan was simply defending, working hard, gaining nothing, each motion costing airspeed and altitude. The Thunderbolt's strength became burden. Heavy aircraft defended well when handled decisively. Yet when forced into repeated reactive maneuvers without a payoff, they became labor. Inside the cockpit, the engine sound seemed louder. His breathing felt hot and close. He glanced at the manifold pressure, then back outside. The right wing still answered. The rudder felt rougher. He knew if he let the fight become a pure spiral of defense, the Germans would eventually walk him into a shot. So he stopped answering the nearest threat and instead hunted the true one. The real danger was the patient high 109 with altitude to spare. Sloan pushed the nose down toward a series of wooded folds east of the river and performed the oldest trick in combat. He acted weaker than he was. He let the aircraft run as though trying to escape. The high Messerschmitt took the invitation and rolled into a steep chase. Sloan waited until the 109 was fully committed, then abruptly chopped throttle, rolled hard right through inverted, and pulled down the backside of a ridge, where the air was turbulent and visibility momentarily broken by the ground itself. The German had entered too fast. He flashed over Sloan at perhaps 150 yards, belly exposed and beginning a hasty climb to recover. Sloan fired upward through the turn. The burst struck the underside of the fuselage and tail. The 109 snapped into a vertical spin, shedding fragments, and vanished into the trees east of the road to Linz. 4 down. The shift in momentum after that was unmistakable. The remaining 3 Germans did not attack immediately. They circled wider. They reassessed. From the bridgehead below, American anti-aircraft crews began firing whenever one of the circling fighters exposed itself long enough to track. Their fire was mostly inaccurate at that range, but it added pressure and visual noise. Smoke climbed, tracers arced. The sky over Remagen had become a maze of uncertainty. At 3:18 p.m., Sloan crossed west of the Rhine for the first time in the fight, skimming low over the approaches. Men looked up from trucks and bulldozers and saw the wounded Thunderbolt flash overhead, holes in its wing and powder stains around its gun ports. 2 German fighters followed him across. In doing so, they abandoned their original mission entirely. Not one lined up on the bridge. Not one made a clean attack on the crossing. Sloan had drawn the whole strike package into a personal fight, and the 5th kill came south of Remagen over the western hills. A Focke-Wulf, whether from anger or impatience, finally made the mistake Sloan had been waiting for. He tightened into pure pursuit and tried to sit directly behind the Thunderbolt. Sloan felt it in the pressure of the tracers before he clearly saw the aircraft itself. The line was too direct, too eager. He began a shallow left turn as if setting up for a westbound escape. The Focke-Wulf tucked in closer. Sloan counted a beat, then kicked left rudder, rolled right, and let the nose slice under in a fast descending reversal before hauling the aircraft back across the opposite plane. The 190 tried to follow the first move. That was enough. His own speed carried him wide across Sloan's nose. Sloan fired a burst of less than a second. The rounds hit engine and cockpit. The Focke-Wulf simply stopped flying. It entered a descending spiral, tightened, and then struck a wet field near Unkel with a dark bloom of earth and fire. 5 down. By any measure, that was already an extraordinary fight. But Sloan still had 2 enemy fighters airborne, and one of them, a high Messerschmitt, was plainly the sharpest surviving pilot in the sky. The last pair finally used the proper counter. They bracketed him, the 109 high, the 190 low, and offset, forcing him to choose which line to respect. Sloan's ammunition was more than half gone now. Not low yet, but no longer generous. He could not afford long bursts at doubtful angles. He needed controlled close shots, and the Germans were working specifically to deny him that, so he turned east again. Later, in debrief, and this decision drew almost as much comment as the kills themselves. Why go back toward the east bank with enemy fighters still behind you? Why not stay over the western side where friendlies were thicker? Sloan's answer was simple. Because over there, he said, meaning the eastern ridges, the ground had shape. Shape mattered. Hills forced attackers to choose altitude or sightline. Smoke and folds broke patterns. On open sky, the bracket might have worked. Against terrain, Sloan believed he could split it. At 3:21 p.m., he crossed the river low, almost treetop level. The Focke-Wulf came in from low right, trying to pin him against rising ground. The Messerschmitt remained above, waiting to punish any climb. Sloan held steady longer than safety recommended. Tracers cracked by the canopy. One tore through rudder fabric, and another struck behind the seat with a metallic hammer. He rolled left down the contour of a hill, then followed the slope like a man tracking a furrow. The Focke-Wulf had to stay low to keep him in sight. To stay low, he had to sacrifice room. That was the old civilian lesson again. Make the other man choose between safe flying and continuous sight. Sloan crossed a narrow ravine, hauled the P-47 up just enough to clear the next wooded fold, then snapped into a rightward rolling reverse. The low Focke-Wulf, now committed and altitude-starved, had nowhere to go. He shot across Sloan's nose from right to left at less than 200 yards. Sloan fired a short burst, deliberate. The rounds entered behind the engine and into the root of the right wing. Fire burst out at once. The Focke-Wulf rolled inverted and disappeared behind the hill. A second later, a black fireball rose through the bare trees. 6 down. Only 1 German fighter remained. Most men at that point would have made survival the only objective. Sloan wanted survival too. But he also knew the remaining Messerschmitt still had the altitude and freedom to attack the bridgehead if he chose. As long as that fighter stayed in the air, the danger below was unfinished. At 3:23 p.m., the last 109 began circling above Sloan, rather than diving immediately. He had watched 6 comrades die in 15 minutes. He was cautious now, perhaps calculating whether to break off, perhaps deciding whether one clean pass might still be worth it. Sloan glanced at his ammunition counters. Hard to trust in combat, but he estimated perhaps a third remained. Enough for a few more hard bursts. Maybe less if a feed had been damaged. He would not get many chances. The German finally came down, offset left, disciplined, refusing to rush. Sloan tried one reversal. The 109 answered by climbing out of the line before overshooting. Sloan tried another. The German stayed patient. This man had learned. He was now fighting Sloan's method instead of being trapped by it. So Sloan did something subtler. He gave the German a pattern. For nearly a minute, he repeated the same defensive rhythm. Slight dive, roll left, pull through, recover low, then again, slight dive, roll left, pull through, recover low. It was dangerous to repeat anything against a good pilot, but Sloan was not repeating it to survive. He was teaching. He wanted the Messerschmitt to believe he understood the escape. The 109 drew a little closer on the next setup, then closer again, not rashly, intelligently. Or the pilot was beginning to cut inside where he believed Sloan would go based on the pattern he had just been shown. At 3:25 p.m., Sloan began the familiar leftward setup one more time. He dipped. He started the roll. And then, halfway through, he broke the pattern completely. Instead of continuing left, he unloaded, stamped hard opposite rudder, and hurled the P-47 into a violent rightward break beneath the German's anticipated line. The Messerschmitt had already committed to cutting inside the old pattern. Suddenly, he was not behind Sloan's future position. He was ahead of empty air. For an instant, the 109 slid down from high left toward the center of Sloan's windscreen, closer than any of the others had been at the moment of firing. 140 yards, maybe a little more. Sloan fired by eye, by closure, by the same kind of instinct that once told him exactly when to reverse over a fence line with a loaded crop duster and no room to drift. The burst walked from spinner to cockpit. The Messerschmitt shuddered violently. The propeller sheared free. The engine tore loose in fragments. The fuselage rolled over trailing smoke, metal, and glycol, then crashed on the eastern slope above the river road. At 3:26 p.m., 15 minutes after the first German fighter had settled onto his tail, the fight was over. 7 had come for him, 7 were gone. For several seconds, Sloan did not feel triumph. He felt emptiness. Battle often ends like that, not with a swell of music, but with a sudden absence of sound inside the mind while the engine is still roaring and the body is only beginning to realize how close it has come to death. His right hand shook on the throttle. His shoulders ached from the strain of violent maneuver. He tested the controls gently. The rudder was damaged. One elevator felt rough. The canopy had a spreading crack on the starboard side. He tried the radio again. Static, then one broken fragment of English, then nothing. He turned west. Below him, the bridgehead was still active. Smoke drifted. Trucks moved. Engineers kept working. The bridge had not taken a concentrated fighter strike in those 15 minutes because every attacking aircraft had been forced into the fight with him. That fact mattered more to Sloan than the number itself. He landed back at Saint-Dizier a little after 4:10 p.m. Armorers counted approximately 900 rounds remaining, though later they admitted the exact figure was uncertain because one gun had partly jammed near the end of the fight. The ground crew stared at the aircraft in disbelief. The right wing was holed, the tail was hit, the rudder fabric was torn open. There were fresh powder burns around the gun ports and a deep scar near the cockpit armor plate. When Sloan climbed down, a crew chief asked the casual question men ask before they are ready for the answer. How many? Sloan pulled off one glove and said, 7. Nobody believed him at first. The intelligence debrief began with skepticism. 3 perhaps seemed possible. 4 in a confused action, maybe. 7 in 15 minutes by one damaged Thunderbolt pilot over a bridgehead crawling with smoke and flak sounded like a story men would later trim into reason. But then pilots from the squadron straggled in and reported parts of what they had seen. Bridge engineers filed witness statements. Anti-aircraft crews on both banks reported crashes in the river, on the ridge, in the fields south of town. Gun camera film, though incomplete and jostled by maneuver, showed enough of the firing passes to support the central claim. By nightfall, the debrief room had gone quiet. Major Harker, the same officer who had once doubted the very idea of Sloan's rolling reversals, stood over the map board and said, "Tell it again from the beginning." Sloan did, calmly, without flourish. He described the closure rates, the throttle changes, why the first reversal had to start before the enemy settled into a comfortable lead. He explained using smoke not as cover alone, but as a way to distort expectation. He talked about ridge lines, drift, and why a repeated pattern was only useful if a man knew exactly when to break it. He did not call it genius. He made it sound like work. The squadron's technical summary reduced the whole thing to military language. A series of low-altitude rolling reversals designed to induce overshoot and convert hostile pursuit into close crossing shots. That was accurate, but it missed the human truth. Sloan had taken a civilian skill no one thought mattered much in air doctrine and turned it into a combat method under impossible odds. The medal recommendation moved quickly, though wartime paperwork was a battlefield of its own. He was eventually awarded the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism in aerial combat over the Remagen bridgehead. Some in the squadron believed the action merited even more. Sloan never argued the point. He wore the medal when required and said little about it. What spread faster than the citation was the method. Not formally across the Army Air Forces. The war was already rushing toward its end, But within the 506th and nearby units, instructors began speaking of Sloan's roll or the orchard roll, depending on who was doing the talking. Young pilots practiced sharper reversals at altitude, learned to think in terms of closure and expectation, and heard the warning that the move was not a trick. Done late, it killed you. Done early, it saved you. Done against a disciplined enemy, it required patience, terrain sense, and nerve. Sloan did not stop flying after Remagen. That was another reason his story never hardened into a clean legend. There was no final curtain. 2 days later, he was back over Germany on patrol. 9th Air Force file. It was unusually thick. Witness statements, gun camera references, maintenance notes on the damaged P-47, a sketch map with timings penciled in. German loss records later matched several of the crashes. American ground observers confirmed others. The more the historian dug, the clearer it became. This was not mess hall legend inflated by memory. It was a documented action swallowed by the larger collapse of Germany and then overlooked because the man at its center had never tried to publicize it. An article followed, then a museum inquiry. Sloan's family opened old boxes and found logbooks, citation papers, and a small scrap of handwritten notes in his own hand. On that scrap, amid rough arrows and quick lines, one instruction appeared twice: roll before he settles. That phrase now appears in exhibits and lectures about forgotten individual air actions of the late war. Not because it was some magical formula. It was not. It was a reminder of how deeply human combat remains, even in machine-age warfare. Timing, judgment, experience carried from one life into another. A man who had spent years reversing a crop duster over orchard rows understood something about motion, expectation, and commitment that no manual had taught him. Under pressure, with no instructor and no committee above the Rhine to approve his idea, he trusted what work had taught him. That is why Emmett Sloan's story matters. Not simply because he shot down 7 enemy fighters in 15 minutes, though that alone would be enough to mark him out. It matters because his victory was not luck and not wild heroics. It was a disciplined application of a civilian craft to combat at exactly the moment ordinary doctrine ran out of room. He did not win because he was reckless. He won because he was precise, because he understood wind, closure, terrain, and human expectation. Because while other men saw low-altitude rolling reversals as a dangerous stunt, he saw them as controlled field work in another sky. The bridge at Remagen would not stand much longer. It finally collapsed later in March, after carrying men and materiel across at a rate that helped crack the western defenses of Germany wide open. But on March 10th, it was still alive, still loaded, still under threat. And in one violent quarter hour, a single Thunderbolt pilot from Yakima helped keep it that way. History tends to remember what is easiest to summarize: the famous names, the highest scores, the biggest formations, the battles with clean beginnings and endings. It is less generous to men whose greatness happened once, decisively. In April, he flew armed reconnaissance, escort, and rail-cutting strikes as Allied forces drove deeper east. He scored 2 additional victories before the war ended, bringing his total to 9 confirmed aerial kills. Yet among the men who knew him, the number mattered less than the way he flew. Quietly, competently, never showy, always reading the ground and weather as carefully as the enemy. One replacement pilot later said Sloan could glance down once at a valley and remember every useful feature in it: which ridge cast shadow longest, where smoke would bank, which road cut signaled a ravine, where a low aircraft might vanish from a pursuer's sightline. He flew like a man who had learned danger from work, not from theory, the pilot remembered years later. When Germany surrendered, Sloan did what thousands of veterans did and almost nobody truly understands unless they lived it. He packed away the war and went home. Yakima did not give him a parade on the scale of cities back east. It gave him orchards, equipment needing repair, a father growing older, and the familiar smell of dust and fruit trees in the dry summer air. He married Ruth Halverson in 1947. He bought into a small aerial application business with another veteran. For the next quarter century, he flew over Washington fields, spraying crops, watching weather, and living once again by practical skill rather than memory. He did not build his life around being a war hero. The medals stayed mostly out of sight. The combat photographs lived in envelopes. His children knew he had flown fighters. They knew he had been overseas. But like many men of his generation, he rarely gave the war full voice. If asked directly, he would answer briefly and then shift to engines, yields, or wind conditions. Now and then the past showed through in ways family later remembered. He always wanted to know where the high ground was when driving unfamiliar roads. He disliked wasteful turns in anything with wheels. He still judged weather by looking at treetops before he trusted forecasts. Once, at the end of a row in an orchard, his son asked why he seemed to hesitate and look over his shoulder before every reverse. Sloan smiled slightly and said, "Because that's where trouble usually comes from." He died in 1983 at the age of 62. His obituary called him a veteran, husband, father, church member, and longtime crop pilot. It did not say that on a cold March afternoon in 1945 he had fought 7 German fighters alone over Remagen and destroyed them all. It did not say that he had turned an enemy strike away from one of the most important river crossings of the war. It did not say that an ordinary American civilian skill had once altered the shape of battle in the sky. For a time, that story nearly disappeared. It came back because records survived and because historians sometimes notice what fame forgets. In the mid-1990s, a military historian researching air cover over the Remagen bridgehead found Sloan's after-action packet in a mislabeled and then was folded back into ordinary life. And men like Sloan often vanish into the margins because they returned home, worked hard, raised families, and did not insist on being remembered. But memory has responsibilities too. So when we picture the air war over Germany in 1945, when we imagine the cold river, the smoke over the bridge, the cliffs above Remagen, and the exhausted remnants of the Luftwaffe still hurling themselves at impossible odds, we should leave room for one more image. A battered P-47 low over the Rhine. 7 enemy fighters closing in, a pilot glancing once at the ground, once at the smoke, and then using something learned long before the war to turn pursuit into ruin. Emmett Ray Sloan was not the loudest hero of the Second World War. He was not the most decorated. He did not spend his life telling the story afterward. But on March 10th, 1945, over Remagen, he met impossible odds with judgment, discipline, and a skill no one else had thought important enough to trust. And because he did, men below kept crossing the Rhine. That is the kind of story history should hold on to. If you want to honor forgotten men like Lieutenant Emmett Ray Sloan, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more true-to-spirit wartime stories, and leave a respectful comment in his memory. Some heroes asked for nothing after the war. The least we can do now is make sure they are not forgotten.